Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I'm your host of Killer Instinct. Before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You are not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you are subscribed. Now, if you guys tuned in to last week's episode, then you would know that we have dedicated the true crime category for the month of November to cover cases that occurred around Thanksgiving, and this case is no different. The case that we are talking about today is oftentimes referred to as the Thanksgiving Massacre for reasons that you will soon understand. But before we get into today's episode, I do want to put out a trigger warning. Today's episode is going to be mentioning gun violence to a minor, and I wanted to make you guys aware of that before jumping in. If that is something that is triggering to you, that is completely understandable, and I just wanted to give you guys the chance to exit out of this episode before we get into it, and I will see you next week. So with that being said, let's jump into it today. So to begin this case, we need to talk about a married couple named Jim and Muriel Sitton. Now, the Sittons lived in Jupiter, Florida, which is located north of West Palm Beach, and it's known to be a very idyllic community. It's a town of approximately 60,000 people, so not small by any sense of the word, but for all things considered, it was known to be a very safe place. Now, in December of 2002, Jim and Muriel welcomed their daughter, who they named Michaela. Now, Michaela was the light of Jim and Muriel's lives. Muriel actually homeschooled Michaela, so they spent a lot of time together, and Michaela was incredibly intelligent. She loved to read, and she also spoke French. Now, this case begins in November of 2009, and Muriel and Jim were actually hosting Thanksgiving at their home in November of 2009. They were hosting the Thanksgiving celebration, and the Sittons absolutely loved Thanksgiving. It was one of their favorite holidays to celebrate, and in 2009, they were really excited for everyone to be coming to their house to have a Thanksgiving dinner, and they were going to be hosting a large party, and it was all expected to be a really exciting time. Muriel was cooking in the kitchen, and she was preparing food for approximately 16 people, most of that being family members of theirs, and it included aunts and uncles and cousins and some friends as well. Some of the family members that were attending the Thanksgiving celebration included Muriel's aunt and uncle, Carol and Mike Marriage, as well as their daughters. They had 34-year-old twin daughters named Carla and Lisa, and they were going as well. Lisa was working as a luxury real estate broker, and Carla worked as a court advocate who represented children in legal cases. Muriel, Lisa, and Carla were all extremely close. They had a very tight-knit relationship ever since Lisa and Carla were born, and Muriel was really someone that Lisa and Carla looked up to. She was someone that they really idolized, and they looked at her as like a big sister figure. And this specific Thanksgiving celebration was an even bigger celebration than normal because Lisa had actually announced to the family that her and her husband Patrick had found out that she was pregnant. So everyone was over the moon about this news. This was just a really exciting time for everyone. Other people in attendance to this Thanksgiving celebration was Muriel's other cousin, which happened to be Lisa and Carla's brother, who was named Paul. And Paul joined the celebration, and this was actually a noticeable thing. This was a noticeable event that Paul joined in on this Thanksgiving celebration because he lived in Miami and he was not typically around for every family gathering. So the fact that he was there on this Thanksgiving celebration in 2009 was something that was noticeable. So as far as Thanksgiving itself, everyone arrived at Muriel and Jim's home at approximately 5 p.m. or a little bit before for Thanksgiving dinner. And afterwards, the The family had a tradition of doing a holiday sing-along. They would all gather around and sing Christmas carols or holiday songs, really just to close out Thanksgiving. And it was a really uplifting moment and a tradition that they always looked forward to because, again, it was a nice way to end the night and close out the Thanksgiving celebration. After the holiday sing-along is when Michaela was tucked into bed by her parents and everyone began to say their goodbyes. The night was closing out, people were saying goodbye to their family and friends, food was being put away, but all of a sudden, everything changed. 911 operators in Jupiter received several phone calls from the Sitton's neighbors saying that they were hearing gunshots from the Sitton home. Some neighbors reported hearing screams and said it sounded like a fight had broken out, and officers were immediately dispatched out to the Sitton home, not knowing what happened, not knowing what the situation was. All they knew was that shots had been fired. Now, within minutes of those phone calls, police arrived to the home and they learned that multiple people had been shot, and unfortunately, several of those people were dead. Along with those fatalities, Lisa's husband, Patrick, as well as 6-year-old Michaela were rushed to the hospital because they also suffered from gunshot wounds and were being treated for their injuries. Now, with very little information, the police ended up walking into the home and they are horrified at what they see. In the kitchen, Muriel's cousin Carla was laying on the floor, dead from a gunshot wound to her head. And laying right next to Carla was Muriel's mother, Raymond, who had been shot in the stomach and in the chest. Lisa's body was also found laying outside of the door off of the patio. She had been shot dead as well, and it appeared that she tried to crawl her way to safety before succumbing to her injuries. Now, after canvassing the downstairs of the home and noticing the fatalities, police then made their way upstairs, which was where Michaela's bedroom was located. Now, Michaela's bedroom was an incredibly bloody scene. Police found blood in her bed. They also found blood on the floor. But something that stood out as odd to authorities was the fact that Michaela was shot at all. Whoever the shooter was, they would have had to have gone out of their way to go upstairs to Michaela's room to hurt her. There was no one else on that second floor at the time that Michaela had been shot. So someone had to have gone out of their way to go up to the second story and intentionally shoot Michaela. Now, as far as the Sitton home goes, other than the blood, there were also bullet casings scattered throughout the home, but police didn't have the actual murder weapon at the scene. And again, at this point, they did not know what they were dealing with. They knew they had multiple people who had gunshot injuries. They knew that they had multiple fatalities, but they did not know what had happened that led them to this point. So they needed to speak to the family members in the home that survived the attack, which they started with Muriel and Jim. So Muriel and Jim were escorted to a neighbor's home and they were not allowed to leave. Muriel claimed that at this point, she was begging with the authorities to allow her to go to the hospital to be with her daughter. However, police had told her that at that point, everyone was being considered a suspect and she was not allowed to go to the hospital, and neither was Jim. Everyone needed to be questioned and cleared by the authorities before they were allowed to leave the scene. So at this point, Jim and Muriel had explained to the police what had happened leading up to the shooting. According to them, they had a successful Thanksgiving dinner with their family. There was nothing out of the ordinary. There was nothing that stood out as being problematic or wrong. After Thanksgiving dinner, they did their holiday sing-along tradition, and at the end of the night, when everything was winding down, that is when they said the gunshots began. And Muriel and Jim said that once those initial gunshots went off, everyone ducked to the ground. They said that Carla was shot first and she immediately dropped to the ground, and that is when the chaos ensued. But regardless, both Muriel and Jim claimed that they did not see who this gunman was. Have you ever heard about the woman who woke up in a cold sweat, like she just had a nightmare, but she knew what she saw while she was sleeping was more than just a bad dream? Or the violinist who disappeared from the orchestra pit in front of thousands of people in the audience? What about when a mark left behind at a crime scene led investigators to wonder if there were devil-worshipping occultists prowling their rural community? Well, the Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is nothing but these kinds of stories. Each episode is meticulously crafted to keep you hanging on every word until the final chilling twist. And well, each episode is strange, dark, and mysterious. Seriously, the host, Mr. Ballin, has this unique ability to keep listeners balanced on the edge of life and death with just a dash of excitement like I've never heard before. Follow Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. Prime members can listen early and ad-free on the Amazon Music app. Jim said that once the gunshots were going off, his main priority was survival. He wasn't looking to see who had the gun. He was just trying to get to safety. Jim said that once everyone was ducking to the ground, Jim yelled out for everyone to run out the side door of the kitchen to try and escape out of the home. Now, while this was all happening, Muriel also was able to escape from the kitchen by going into the laundry room, which is where she hid. Now, the laundry room also had access to the backyard of the home through a separate door that was in that laundry room. So she was able to take that back door and get out to the backyard, which is where she met with Jim and the others that were able to survive and make it outside. Now, Muriel said that once she made it outside and had reconnected with Jim and some of the others, their main priority was trying to figure out a way to get to Michaela. She went on to say that while her and Jim were trying to come up with a plan on how they were going to get to their daughter, that is when she was able to see through the upstairs window the shadow of a figure walking down the hallway towards Michaela's bedroom. And again, she was outside in the backyard at this point, so she is seeing all of this happening through this window. She sees the figure walking towards Michaela's bedroom, and within seconds, she heard 3 gunshots go off. At this point, Jim said that he immediately just ran inside of the home trying to get to his daughter, and that when he went inside, he saw that the front door of the home had been opened, so whoever this gunman was had already escaped at that point. But again, his priority was his daughter. He ran upstairs to Michaela's bedroom, saw that she had been shot, ran her downstairs, and paramedics arrived shortly after that, and that is when they took Michaela to the hospital. But unfortunately, during their time of being questioned by authorities, Muriel and Jim received the news that Michaela had also succumbed to her injuries and passed away. So at this point, police had a quadruple homicide to solve, and the victims of this homicide, again, were Michaela, Carla, Lisa, and Raymond, which was Muriel's mother. Now, in order to solve this case, police knew that they needed to speak with everyone who had survived at this Thanksgiving dinner. There were 12 people who survived, and police were going through one by one, talking to each one of them, trying to figure out if they saw the gunmen. However, no one did. That was until Muriel's father, Tony, came to speak to police. Muriel said that while she herself was speaking to authorities, she watched as her dad walked out of the house. And at that point, she did not know who had survived the attack, who was killed. So you could imagine her shock and relief when she saw her father, Tony, walk out of the home. But not only was she seeing him and knowing that he survived, Tony came forward and said that he saw who the gunman was. According to Tony, who was a doctor, when his wife, Muriel's mother, was shot, he went over to her and tried to assist with her injuries and tried to save her. And that is when the shooter walked up behind him and pointed the gun directly at Tony. Tony said that when he looked up, he saw Paul holding a gun and pointing it directly at him. Now remember, Paul was the brother of Lisa and Carla, who again lived in Miami at the time. Tony said at this point he begged Paul to stop what he was doing and to put down the gun, but that is when Paul responded by putting the gun directly to Tony's head and pulling the trigger. However, the gun jammed. Afterwards, Paul began walking away, but looked back at Tony and said the words, quote unquote, I've been waiting to do this for 20 years. So, with this information, police now knew who they were looking for. They knew who their shooter was, and they knew they needed to find Paul. They ended up putting out a public warning about Paul being armed and dangerous. They said that Paul was seen leaving the Sitton home in his Toyota Camry car wearing a white shirt and blue jeans. And when police were speaking to some of the Sitton neighbors, multiple of them reported seeing someone walking calmly away from the Sitton house directly after the shooting, which everyone believed to be Paul. Now, police brought in the U.S. Marshals and the FBI on this case to try and track down Paul. The Jupiter police contacted the Miami police and got a search warrant for Paul's apartment. Now, from Jupiter to Miami is about an hour and a half drive. So at that point, police figured that Paul very well could have either gone back to his apartment or be on his way back there. So they had Miami police go to Paul's apartment and see. However, when Miami police arrived, Paul was nowhere to be found. Miami police then tried to search Paul's apartment, trying to look for any evidence or information as to where Paul could have gone, but there was nothing in this apartment that gave them any clues or any leads whatsoever. But by doing a deeper dive into Paul's purchase history and his bank information, police were able to piece together some of the activities that Paul did leading up to this shooting. And many of the things he was doing pointed to this Thanksgiving massacre being a premeditated attack. Because again, up until this point, police did not know what the motive was. They didn't know what Paul's state of mind was or what his thought process was. So they did not know if this was premeditated or if this was a blitz attack. But what they were able to figure out by looking at Paul's bank information was that on November 19th, 2009, Paul made multiple large ATM transactions, taking out over $12,000 in cash. In his apartment, there were also several receipts from firearms stores where he purchased multiple guns. Now, it was with this information that a nationwide manhunt was launched for Paul, and I want to now give you a little bit more information on the backstory of Paul and what we know about him that led to this day. Now, growing up, Paul Marriage was really the poster child. He was an honor student and he was a kicker for the high school football team. He grew up in a very well-off family with his mom and his sisters, Lisa and Carla. His father was very successful, and his father hoped that his son, Paul, would follow in his footsteps and take over the business one day. However, after high school, this is when Paul's behavior began to change and he started to experience some trouble. Paul attended the University of Miami, and this is when he began showing signs of severe OCD. His mom said that he became obsessive over germs or any sickness or illness. He would obsessively wash his hands and oftentimes take 2-hour-long showers. And over time, his OCD became so crippling that Paul became incapable of making the smallest of decisions. He began taking certain medications, but nothing seemed to be working. And this definitely had an impact on how Paul viewed himself, but also viewed the family dynamic. Paul sat back and watched as his sisters, Lisa and Carla, thrived. Again, they both were really thriving in their careers. Lisa had recently gotten pregnant. She was married, and he was watching all of this happen and also watching how that was not happening to him. After college, Paul moved back home to be with his parents and live at home with his family. But after a certain amount of time, his parents did tell him that it was time for him to leave and start a life of his own. They did help him with getting an apartment in Miami, but Paul really saw this as an act of betrayal. He thought that his family was turning their back on him, and he saw it as his family kicking him out and not wanting anything to do with him, and it made him very angry and resentful because, again, he's watching everyone else in his life succeed while he is the outcast. He is the loner. He is the one where none of this is happening to, and he believes in his mind that he deserves to have those successes as well. So again, going back to the manhunt manhunt had ensued and everyone was looking for Paul. All law enforcement, this was really an all hands on deck situation, trying to find where Paul could be. Police were putting up flyers in the neighborhood that Paul lived in. They were putting up flyers in his parents' neighborhood, any neighborhood that Paul had previously lived in. There were flyers about how he was wanted. Now, obviously, at this point, police were looking for Paul and wanting to arrest him, but they were also looking for Paul because they were worried that Paul could try and finish the job that he started. There was a fear that police had that Paul could be planning on coming back and murdering the rest of his family. They thought that maybe Paul wasn't satisfied and that he was going to come back to quote unquote finish the job. So there was a lot at stake here. And along with that, police were able to figure out through receipts that Paul had in his apartment that he had purchased a sniper rifle from the firearms store, and this sniper rifle had a scope on it. And what that meant was that if Paul was using this gun, he would be able to shoot his target from over 800 yards away. So he could be hiding anywhere and still be able to commit this kill. So because of this, the Jupiter Police Department put 24-hour surveillance on the Sitton home. Now, by December 7th of 2009, which was a couple weeks after the murder, Paul was added to the U.S. Marshals top 15 most wanted list, and the weeks just continued to pass after that. By January 2nd, the TV show America's Most Wanted did a segment on Paul, and this segment actually included Muriel and Jim. And in this segment, they were going to talk about Paul and really trying to get the word out there, get his picture out there, in the hopes that it would eventually lead to Paul's arrest. But what no one would have predicted was that several hours prior to the America's Most Wanted TV show airing, there was a hotel owner in Key West, Florida. And this hotel owner contacted the police to say that he believed that Paul was staying at his hotel. And for reference, Key West and Jupiter, Florida are about a 4.5-hour drive away from each other. And according to this hotel owner, he said that while he was watching the TV and saw the preview for the America's Most Wanted TV show that was coming out later that night, the preview showed a picture of Paul. And when he saw that picture, he said that he recognized him because that was the man that was staying at his hotel, which was called the Edgewater Lodge. Now, with this tip, police were then on their way. This was the first strong lead that they had in quite some time. And when they arrived at the Edgewater Lodge, they canvassed the area and did surveillance outside of the hotel to see if they could see Paul in his room. This was a smaller hotel. It didn't have many stories, and it was also a hotel where you enter in from the outside. All of the doors are outside. It's not inside of a building. So they were able to see Paul inside of his room. So the fact that they saw Paul in there and knew he was there, police knew that they needed to arrest him. And to further confirm that this was Paul, police also discovered his car, the Toyota Camry, in the parking lot, and Paul had been covering the car with a tarp. So with this, police decided that they were going to raid Paul's hotel room. Collectively, multiple officers went up to the room and stormed in through the door. Now, Paul had attempted to make a sudden move when officers entered into the hotel room. So because of this, one of the officers used a taser on Paul, which caused him to fall to the ground, and he was arrested and transported to the Jupiter Police Department. Now, after arriving to the Jupiter Police Department, Paul refused to speak. He did not want to talk, and he immediately lawyered up. Now, this case did ultimately go to trial. Paul was facing 4 counts of murder as well as 3 counts of attempted murder, and the defense did try and plead insanity for Paul. And leading up to the trial, the prosecution was gathering all of their evidence and trying to gather as strong of a case as they could. And the prosecution needed to paint the picture in this trial of how premeditated this murder was. The prosecution wanted to talk about how Paul never really involved himself in other family gatherings. However, he specifically chose this Thanksgiving to carry out out the murder. They ended up theorizing that Paul knew without a shadow of a doubt that he was going to be killing his family on this specific Thanksgiving. All surviving family members said that during the night of the Thanksgiving dinner, there was no argument, nothing negative took place at this Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone had a very fun and joyful time. Paul didn't make any odd remarks or show any signs of concerning behavior leading up to the shooting. The only noticeable thing was that Paul refused to eat on this specific night. He refused to have any of the Thanksgiving meal that was prepared. And so that was the only odd behavior that was showed. But again, it wasn't made into a concerning ordeal. Other surviving family members said that during the holiday sing-along, Lisa, Carla, and Michaela had gotten up and sang a song, and everyone was clapping and applauding them, but Paul was noticeably sitting off in the corner, really not saying anything, and the prosecution believed that during this song, Paul was scathing with jealousy and rage. They were trying to paint this picture of how Paul was seeing everyone dote over his sisters and Michaela, and he was not given that same treatment, and that is what triggered him to carry out these kills. Now, during the middle of the sing-along portion, Jim actually said that Paul got up and walked through the middle of the living room, really just passing by Lisa, Carla, and Michaela without saying anything. And while it did seem odd and seemed a little bit rude in the moment, no one put too much thought into it, but it is believed that that is when Paul went out to his car and retrieved the gun, walked back in, and began his killing spree. And Paul walking away calmly from the crime scene, as neighbors had described, really showed that he felt a sense of relief of what he had done. He wasn't frantic, he wasn't running away, worried or scared. He felt disturbingly peaceful over what he did. And that theory really strengthened by him saying to Tony that he had been waiting to do this for 20 years. Now, that was what the prosecution was planning on presenting. However, this case actually never ended up going to trial because Paul ended up taking a plea deal. He got 7 life sentences for the quadruple homicide without any chance of parole or any chance of an appeal. Now, for Muriel and Jim, this was not justice. Muriel and Jim were really hoping that Paul would be sentenced to death for what he had done and were disappointed when that was not the case. But nonetheless, the healing process for Muriel and Jim began, and they actually ended up having another child. They had another daughter in 2012 named Natalia, and they chose this name because Natalia was Michaela's favorite doll that she had. And a year and a half after Natalia was born is when they welcomed another daughter named Rayla. And while Jim and Muriel are forever grateful for their family, they continue to honor Michaela however they can. Now, Jim and Muriel in 2011, they actually ended up filing a lawsuit against Paul's parents. Michael and Carol were the parents of Lisa and Carla and Paul. And while Michael and Carol were not at the Sitton home the day of the shooting, Jim and Muriel said that they believe that Michael and Carol knew that Paul was planning these attacks. Jim and Muriel tried to argue in this lawsuit that Michael and Carol knew that Paul was going to this Thanksgiving dinner. Again, he did show up unannounced. And they also tried to say that they had an idea of how dangerous Paul was. There were multiple instances that were pulled as evidence for this to strengthen this argument, one of which was an email that Carol wrote to another relative. And in this specific email, Carol wrote, quote, "Everything is going up, including Paul. It will be interesting to say the least," end quote. And again, that was in regards to that Thanksgiving dinner. And Muriel and Jim believe that that excerpt from that email showed that Carol had some sort of knowledge that something like this could happen. There were other audio recordings of Carol herself saying that she was afraid of her son. And in these recordings, Carol is heard saying, quote, "I hope he doesn't come and kill us all tonight," end quote. And you hear Lisa in this conversation with her mom saying, you know, that also came to my mind, but we can't say anything to Dad because he would get upset. So Muriel and Jim really tried to paint this picture that this could have been preventable had Carol and Michael stepped in to do something about it. However, they never did in Jim and Muriel's mind. Now, this lawsuit was filed on 2 separate occasions. However, the judge of the case had rejected the lawsuit each time, so nothing really ever came of it. However, again, Muriel and Jim were trying to get justice for their daughter and get justice for their other family members who did not survive the attack. Now, I do want to take a moment and talk about Lisa's husband because I know I mentioned him in the beginning as well. Lisa's husband was also shot and he did end up falling into a coma for 3 months. However, luckily, he survived. He was actually the only one who was shot that night who did end up surviving. So he was in a coma for 3 months. However, luckily, he did wake up. And with that being said, that is the Thanksgiving massacre, you guys, and I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about it. Do you believe that Paul should have received the death penalty? Do you believe that the life sentence is justice enough? I just am curious to know your point of view. So let me know in the comments below. But again, with that being said, you guys, that is all for me today. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah. I'm your host. Make sure you go ahead and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. I will be back next week with a brand new one for you guys. And until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.